right. Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Moore, and I'm the news team lead here at Ballotpedia. We're so happy to have all of you joining us here as we talk about what I find to be a really fascinating topic of pivot counties. So as you settle in, I'll give you a brief overview of what exactly these counties are before we dive into the details. So after the 2016 election, Ballotpedia identified 206 counties nationwide that voted for Donald Trump, the Republican candidate for president, after voting for Barack Obama, the Democratic candidate, in 2008 and 2012. And so we named these counties pivot counties. So in 2020, we were interested to know how these pivot counties would vote in the presidential election. Would they again vote for Trump, or would they flip back and vote for Democrat Joe Biden? Now that we have the final results from the presidential election, we're excited to share what we've learned about these pivot counties, how they voted, and what effect they had on the presidential election. So here today, to help me do that, we have Doug Kroneisel, a staff writer on our marquee team. Thanks for being here, Doug.
Happy to be here.
Before we jump into the 2020 results, let's start out by revisiting what led us to identify and analyze these pivot counties in the first place back in 2016.
Well, the one thing that you jumped out at us right away back in 2016 with the pivot counties is where they are. Like you said, there are 206 pivot counties, and they're located across 34 states. The map that you're seeing right now, you can see that most are located in a swath of the country stretching from the upper Midwest into the Northeast. Over a third of the pivot counties are actually located in 4 states that Obama carried in 2012 and that Trump won in 2016. Those are Iowa, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. In presidential election terms, those states account for 50 electoral college votes. So right off the bat, we were seeing these counties that pivoted to Trump concentrated in states that also pivoted to Trump in 2016.
Apart from voting one way or another, what effect did these counties have on overall vote totals in 2016?
Well, that's another aspect that caught our eye. This table shows the 2008, 2012, and 2016 presidential vote totals as a percentage with figures for each candidate's national vote totals, totals in just the pivot counties, and then the difference between those two figures. As you can see, Obama overperformed in pivot counties in 2008 and 2012 by about 1.5%, winning a higher percentage of votes in those counties relative to his national total. In 2016, that flipped and Trump overperformed, winning the pivot counties by about 5 percentage points higher than his national total.
With that decrease for the Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton, do we know the effect pivot counties had nationwide?
Yeah, we do. In 2016, even though all pivot counties accounted for about 5% of the total votes cast in the presidential election, they accounted for 51% of the decline in Democratic votes between 2012 and 2016.
Wow. And now we find ourselves looking back on a whole new presidential election. So with that in mind, then let's go ahead and take a look at how these pivot counties voted in 2020. Ballotpedia developed 2 new terms to describe these pivot counties based on how they voted in the 2020 presidential election. Retained pivot counties to describe the pivot counties that again voted for Trump, and boomerang pivot counties to describe those that flipped back to the Democrat Joe Biden. So Doug, what do the final results tell us then? How many pivot counties were retained and how many were boomerangs?
Well, as you can see here, in total, there were 181 retained pivot counties and 25 boomerang pivot counties. This map that we're showing gives an idea of where those counties are located, with retained pivot counties shown in red and boomerang pivot counties shown in blue. The 181 retained pivot counties are located across 32 states. And the state with the most retained pivot counties is Iowa, where all 31 pivot counties once again voted for Trump. The 25 boomerang pivot counties are located across 16 states. The states with the most boomerang pivot counties are Minnesota and New York, both with 4.
With these numbers in hand, then let's start digging into the data to see what differentiates retained pivot counties from boomerang pivot counties. We know who they voted for, but do we have any idea by how much? Like, what did the margins look like for each category of Pivot County?
Well, Trump won the 181 retained pivot counties with an average margin of victory of 14.1 percentage points, and Biden won the 25 boomerang pivot counties with an average margin of 3.3 percentage points. Trump's margin of victory decreased in 68 retained pivot counties and increased in 113 when compared to his 2016 results.
How about Biden? We can't compare his margins of victory in the boomerang pivot counties to 2016 results, but how do they compare to Obama's margins in 2012, the last time a Democrat won in these counties?
Sure, when compared to Obama's 2012 results, Biden's margins of victory in boomerang pivot counties decreased in 22 counties. He exceeded Obama's margin in three, Hillsborough County in New Hampshire, Saratoga County in New York, and Clallam County in Washington.
Right now, we're just comparing the 2020 results to recent elections. Were there any trends we can see in the historical data leading up to this moment, or any trends we might see moving forward?
Definitely. If you take a look at this next table we've got here, it shows the average Democratic margins of victory across these counties going back to the 2008 election. As you can see, Obama tended to perform better in what would become the boomerang pivot counties, so in 2008 and in 2012. Moreover, in 2016, when both retained and boomerang pivot counties voted for Trump, Trump's average margin in what would become the retained pivot counties was about 6 times larger than his margins in the boomerang pivot counties.
And the bottom portion of this table with the change between years looks like it is showing that Democratic margins in all of these pivot counties first began decreasing in 2012 before the largest decreases in 2016.
Exactly. And then in 2020, we see a 1.4 percentage point increase in Republican margins in retained pivot counties and a 5.4 percentage point increase for Democrats in boomerang pivot counties, which makes up a little less than half of the swing in those boomerang pivot counties that went towards Republicans in 2016. So when we say boomerang, it doesn't necessarily mean these counties are voting the same way they were voting before 2016, just that they flip back to the Democrats this election cycle.
Interesting. That's so fascinating. At the end of the day, we do see some differences in how these counties voted in the past and how they voted more recently. So now let's pick out some more of those differences to get a better idea of the makeup of some of these counties.
Yeah, a great place to start for that would be taking a look at the demographics. Now, when we first analyzed all 206 pivot counties, we noticed that they tended to have more white persons, fewer foreign-born persons, more persons in poverty, and fewer persons with bachelor's degree when compared to the national averages. To touch on just one of those points as an example, in the United States, about 62% of people identify as white alone, not Hispanic or Latino. In the average pivot county, about 80% of people identify as such, with 82% of pivot counties, all 206, above the national average.
And that analysis was based on data from 2015. So today we have some more up-to-date numbers, correct?
We do, using the census data from 2019. And one of the first big differences we noticed was population. Boomerang pivot counties tend to be more populous than retained pivot counties, with a median population of about 160,000 compared to 27,000 for retained pivot counties. This map shows us the counties again, but this time with dots sized to reflect the population of the counties. The population of all 206 pivot counties is about 15 million, and the 25 boomerang pivot counties account for 26% of that total.
You also mentioned some other data points that stood out back in 2016, like foreign-born people, bachelor's degrees, and poverty levels. Are there any differences there between retained and boomerang pivot counties?
Yeah, and you can take a look at this table here for more information. It's set up to show averages across the counties, medians, and then the columns on the right show the number and percentage of pivot counties that were above the US average. I've also added in some extra information for added context, but with foreign-born persons, for example, we see that averages of both retained and boomerang pivot counties are below the US average. That's primarily because pivot counties in general were below that average. However, the 3 pivot counties that exceeded that average were all retained pivot counties this year: Monroe and St. Lucie counties in Florida and Suffolk County in New York. And those counties have about 15 to 20% population of foreign-born persons.
And then with bachelor's degrees, it looks like boomerang pivot counties tend to have higher levels of attainment compared to retained pivot counties.
That's correct. Of the 5 pivot counties with the highest level of bachelor degree holders, 4 are boomerang pivot counties.
Poverty levels for both also appear to be above the national average. Has that changed since 2016?
Well, poverty levels actually decreased in both retained and boomerang pivot counties since the 2016 election by about 1.5 percentage points for each. However, the national average has decreased more quickly by about 3 percentage points. So there are actually more counties with poverty levels above the national average today than there were in 2016, despite that decrease. About 42 more retained pivot counties and 6 more boomerang pivot counties.
And I'm sure we will have more information available once the 2020 census is released. Let's switch gears and talk about voter turnout, because turnout in the presidential election this year was at its highest level since 1920. Was that increase seen in retained and boomerang pivot counties as well?
It was, to varying degrees. 79% of retained pivot counties and 76% of boomerang pivot counties recorded their highest turnout rate since at least 2008. For comparison's sake, you can take a look at this chart. It gives a look at voter turnout nationwide in retained pivot counties in red and in boomerang pivot counties in blue since 2008.
So in 2020, boomerang pivot counties had a turnout rate of about 72%, above the national rate of 69%, and retained pivot counties had a turnout rate of about 68%.
Yep, and both retained and boomerang pivot counties saw their turnout rates increase by about 7 percentage points this year. What we found was that turnout in boomerang pivot counties has tended to exceed that in retained pivot counties by an average of 4 percentage points since 2008. We can also take a look at this map that's going to be showing the voter turnout to get a better understanding of where that turnout was higher and lower. Now, this map does not differentiate between retained and boomerang pivot counties, but we can still see by the darker shades that turnout was high in the upper Midwest and Great Lakes region. In fact, Door County, Wisconsin, a boomerang pivot county, it's located in the peninsula there on Wisconsin, it had a turnout rate of just under 90%.
Wow. It also looks like turnout was up in the pivot counties in Florida and the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, and regarding the latter, those counties, one of which was a boomerang and 7 of which were retained, saw some of the largest increases in voter turnout compared to 2016, with Pacific County, Washington, which is a retained pivot county, increasing nearly 17 percentage points from the previous presidential election.
So with all this in mind then, let's end where we began with the presidential election. During the 2020 presidential election, Ballotpedia identified 13 battleground states that have split support for Democratic and Republican candidates in recent election years. What effect did retained and boomerang pivot counties have in those states this year?
Well, for starters, pivot counties are located in 10 of those states. We can take a look at vote totals from a few to get a better understanding. So we're going to start with Wisconsin, which had one of the smallest margins of victory in 2020. This table that you're seeing compares election results in 2016 to those in 2020, broken down by county type. The Wisconsin had 17 retained pivot counties and 2 boomerang pivot counties. The solid Democrat and Republican categories are counties that have either voted for the Democratic or Republican candidate in every election since 2008. So the rightmost column, titled Margin Change, that shows whether Trump or Biden made gains in 2020 relative to 2016 margins in those counties.
Biden won Wisconsin, which we can see in the 2020 margin column, by about 21,000 votes. So it looks like he gained the most votes not from boomerang pivot counties, but from those solid Democratic and Republican counties.
Yeah, the two Boomerang pivot counties in Wisconsin are less populous than others. But as you can see, Trump gained the most new votes from retained pivot counties and solid Republican counties, which contributed to the small size of the statewide margin.
Let's take a look at Iowa, which, as you mentioned before, had the most pivot counties, all of which were retained this year. Did that contribute to Trump's victory in the state?
Well, as you can see over in the change columns, Trump gained just about as many votes in those 31 counties as he did in the state's 6 solid Democrat counties. But his biggest gains came from solid Republican counties. But if you look down at the total margin change, you'll notice that Biden narrowed the margin compared to 2016, but Trump ultimately received about 139,000 more votes than that election.
Okay, how about one more state? Let's do Georgia, which had the smallest margin of any state, with Biden winning by 0.34%, or about 12,000 votes. What role did pivot counties play in that?
So Georgia's unique in that in addition to its 5 retained pivot counties, it also has 3 reverse pivot counties, which we're also taking a look at this year. So these are counties that mirror pivot counties, meaning they voted for Republicans John McCain and Mitt Romney in 2008 and in 2012 before voting for Hillary Clinton, the Democrat, in 2016. Joe Biden won all 6 reverse pivot counties across the country, and he won all 3 in Georgia as well. So those reverse pivot counties actually played a big role in the election. All 3 of them voted for Biden in 2020. The 3 reverse pivot counties are Gwinnett, Cobb, and Henry, which are all located in the metro Atlanta area.
It looks like Biden increased his margin of victory in those counties by about 130,000 votes from Clinton's 31,000 vote margin in 2016. And he gained votes in solid Democratic counties too.
Exactly. I mean, these 2 increases combined resulted in the total margin change that flipped Georgia this election cycle.
So these various types of pivot counties continue to affect election outcomes. It will be interesting to see. Before we wrap up, I believe we received a question from a reader last week for this webinar.
Yes, we received a pretty cool question that sent us down a fun and nerdy rabbit hole. Basically, a reader asked how fickle these pivot counties are. Looking back at multiple elections, they were wondering how frequently do these pivots occur?
And when you say pivot, you mean counties that have followed the same voting pattern as these 206 pivot counties, just further back in time, right?
Yeah, exactly. So basically, how frequently have these 206 pivot counties voted Democrat, Democrat, Republican, or Republican, Republican, Democrat in previous election cycles?
Okay, so let's set this up. The 206 pivot counties in our analysis voted Obama, Obama, Trump, or Democrat, Democrat, Republican from 2008 to 2016. So we want to know how many of these counties voted Republican, Republican, Democrat from 2000 to 2008.
That's exactly where we want to start. Our goal is to find the most pivoting pivot county in the country. So we set out with this question: out of the 206 pivot counties, how many voted for George W. Bush in 2000 and 2004 before pivoting to Obama? I was thinking there's no way there can be that many, if any at all, but the data proved me wrong. As you can see on this map, it turns out there were 57 counties that voted Bush, Bush, Obama, Obama, Trump. That's 2 pivots in a row. 49 were retained pivot counties and 8 were boomerangs.
Then naturally you had to see if you could go back even further.
Of course, back to 1992 to see if any of those 57 pivot counties also voted for Bill Clinton twice. And wouldn't you believe it, there were 35. These counties voted for a Democrat, Clinton, twice, and then a Republican, Bush, twice, then Democrat, Obama, twice, before pivoting back to Republican Trump in 2016.
So now these 35 pivot counties have pivoted 3 times in a row. That's a lot, but I'm guessing that's not all.
It most definitely is not, because now we have to go back to 1984 to see if those 35 pivot counties pivoted a 4th time by voting for Republicans Ronald Reagan in his re-election campaign and George H.W. Bush. And sure enough, there were 22. 21 were retained, and 1 was a Boomerang pivot county.
Well, we can't stop there. Did any of those 22 pivot counties also vote for Democrat Jimmy Carter in his 2 races in 1976 and 1980?
We are getting down to the wire, but sure enough, there were 3 pivot counties, all retained this year, that voted for, get ready for this, Carter, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Clinton, Bush, Bush, Obama, Obama, Trump. Those 3 are Chickasaw County in Mississippi and Calhoun and Colleton counties in South Carolina.
That's 5 pivots in a row. Now, bigger question, is there a 6th?
In fact, there is 1. It is Colleton County, South Carolina, the most pivoting pivot county in the country. Colleton County voted for Richard Nixon in 1968 and 1972 before going on to pivot 6 times. And since Colleton County is a retained pivot county this year, that means they kept their streak going in 2020.
Wow, that is a lot of pivoting pivot counties. It just gives us one more thing to keep an eye on after the next presidential election to see if any of those patterns keep up. But that's what we're here to do. So thanks so much for walking us through it all, Doug. That was great.
Happy to help.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. If you found this content interesting, I highly recommend signing up for our free Daily Brew newsletter, where we frequently dive into analysis like this for our subscribers. And you can also find a lot of details on our pivot county analysis and so much more on our website, ballotpedia.org. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.